Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. Um, First, I'd be remiss if I did not thank Nick and Astor and the entire OFA team for really good organization. I've organized symposiums before, and I know what a pain it can be and how much work it is, so I appreciate you. And also FGV and the whole team here for hosting us. It's been great. And I appreciate that everyone has seemed to take seriously Astor's charge that we all enjoy ourselves and get to know each other. It's been very fun. So I am going to talk about also the value of openness. Jen and I have very similar titles, but very different presentations, as you'll see. So I'm going to speak. I'm at New America, which is a policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. A colleague of mine and I, my colleague Akash Kapoor and I, have been doing some research in partnership with the Digital Public Goods Alliance, specifically focused on how different countries are using digital public goods in their national DPI build-outs. And in this presentation, I'm going to share what our research was, what some of the findings from that research were, and then also we're going to put forth the ongoing piece of this, which is that we're advancing kind of a framework for how you can think about measuring the value of using digital public goods beyond just economic value, and specifically how policymakers in different countries, especially in the developing world, are thinking about what value they can attain from using DPGs instead of using proprietary solutions in their national DPI. Fernanda gave us a good lead into DPI earlier. This is the map that UCL in London has put out. DPI is kind of sweeping the world right now as a movement. As Fernanda noted, it's a very kind of elastic concept at the moment, but many countries are adopting digital ID systems, payment systems, data exchange systems. These are kind of what are considered core DPI. So these three things: payments, data exchange, identity. These were the main things we looked at. However, there are also some sector-specific DPI that we also looked at in health, education, social payments, social assistance primarily. So while the DPI definition is kind of elastic, the DPG definition is pretty strict. So this is what the Digital Public Goods Alliance has put forth as the definition of what a digital public good is. They have 9 indicators that they evaluate these tools based on to determine whether they qualify as a true digital public good. So the point here is it's not just open source. It has to qualify for all these different indicators as well to count as a DPG. The research questions that we focused on were 2. So one, we were trying to understand what strategies and approaches enable the successful adoption of DPGs for DPI. I have a background as a journalist and a researcher primarily focused on institutions, and especially the politics that inform institutions. And so our goal here was to look at how countries are thinking about adopting, what their implementation journeys actually look like, where the rubber meets the road of implementation, and then to try and tell some of those stories in narrative detail with the hope that other countries might be able to look at that and then learn for themselves about where they might go. The second goal, or the second research question, which is what we're talking about today, is what value do DPGs provide relative to proprietary solutions, and how do you actually quantify and measure that impact? And that's where the framework comes in and what we're going to talk about. So our approach to the study was we did country case studies, and we did 3 case studies: the Philippines, Kyrgyzstan, and Rwanda. We chose these because we wanted our criteria were that we wanted to get a good geographic selection. So we wanted countries from different parts of the world. We wanted to find countries that had been adopting, DPGs for core functions. And we didn't want to focus on, the usual candidates. There are some countries that have received a lot of research attention in this space, Estonia, India in particular. So we wanted to find some that were not the typical candidates. Our method was, so case studies, we did a literature review on each country and on DPG value overall. And then we conducted interviews with policymakers in these countries, with academic experts, with external partners, with civil society leaders, others that were involved in observing and in actually implementing the DPG build-outs in these countries. So the main meat of the research came from the conversations with the government leaders who are actually implementing this. Very quick overview of each of these case studies, the stories that were revealed. So in the Philippines, they have rolled out what they call PhilSys, which is the National Digital ID Program that is based on MOSIP, a digital public good created in India, modeled after Aadhaar. And the main situation for the Philippines is that they've been stuck in a series of bad proprietary contracts. Like vendor lock-in has been a really bad problem there. They wanted to roll out a national ID system. They were taken to India. They saw Aadhaar. They were very impressed with it. And then they wanted an open source solution, and MOSIP was there. And so that's what they've been implementing. In payments, there's a fascinating story with this initiative called IGALA. So again, bad vendor lock-in. The Philippines had they have a national payment switch that is operated by a MasterCard owned company. They got locked into a contract that did not help them achieve their goals. They wanted to expand financial inclusion by making a truly nationwide payment switch. The costs are too high, it's too expensive. They have no autonomy to be able to make feature changes. There's no flexibility. Whenever they want to make a change, they have to go to this company, and the company doesn't make the changes because the architecture is monolithic, and it would entail them making changes to all the other iterations around the world. So basically, they got locked into this system. The central bank was thinking about what a solution would be. Instead of going the Brazil route and creating their own PIX-like system, because the politics around that were a little fraught at the time in the Philippines, they authorized a venture-backed private sector competitor, a startup, to create an alternative switch. And this startup is based on Mojaloop, which is a completely open digital payment switch, and they are now implementing this. And the idea is that this might actually supplant the proprietary switch in the country. So it's like a competitor, and it's a challenge, and it's a different delivery model that's kind of interesting. There also are pilots with OpenCRVS, which is a civil registry system, OpenG2P and OpenSPP. These are both related to the targeting and delivery of social assistance payments. These are being piloted by champions in the Department of Social Welfare and Development. Kyrgyzstan, the main story is that they have implemented X-Road. They were choosing, so anti-corruption motivated them to try and digitize all government data and government service delivery. They considered options, and they were presented with a much more affordable data exchange solution from a Russian vendor that was interoperable and had open standards. However, they couldn't see the source code, and they would be dependent on this vendor, and so that raised a red flag about sovereignty and independence. So they went with X-Road and have been implementing it there. And then Rwanda, they have a Mojaloop-based payment switch, and then DHIS2 for health, which has been quite advanced there. So we did these case studies, and out of this, we kind of developed this framework for value, and we thought about this in 4 dimensions. So you can think of value in terms of economic value, social value, governance value, and political value. Some of these overlap. Big picture, we're trying to move beyond like direct benefit and direct cost savings into these squishier things. What are the indirect benefits? What are the ecosystem, the value to the entire ecosystem that you get from this? And another consideration, something that came out in all of our interviews, was that there is the real outcome value from the impact of these systems. But there's also a lot of like perceptual value that the policymakers are getting. You know, the politics end up playing a really big part in what policymakers think these solutions can do for their countries. Just some caveats, obviously. A lot of these rollouts are very early, so they're very nascent, so there's not a lot of impact data. It's very hard to find quantitative data on a lot of these. In many cases, we found even like total cost of ownership analysis wasn't done when they were procuring a lot of these solutions. A lot of stuff was back of the envelope. So this is all, it's all early days. We don't know yet exactly what a lot of the impact will be. Again, this is a qualitative study. And then the case study approach, you know, it gives you good exemplars, and ideally you look for generalizable lessons out of it. But, you know, it's only 3 countries, so it's limited in that way. So I'm going to go over a few of just, you know, what we learned in each of these, or how we thought about the different components of each of these dimensions of value. And again, this is ongoing work. We just are kind of putting this forward. We don't have a very clear rubric of what goes in here, but this is some of the stuff that came out that we thought was important. Economic value, there's obviously direct cost savings. There's also all these hidden costs. What are the economic costs in the long term of being locked into a particular vendor, of the fact that your data systems are not interoperable, that you have redundant, you know, duplicative systems within your ecosystem. A big factor was market expansion and creation. You know, how do DPGs enable the creation of new markets? The private dimension was really important, we found. So how can DPGs stimulate the creation of new private sector ecosystems and innovations? And the big point here was that DPGs, even though it's public, you know, they're very active in shaping markets, and you really get a lot of value when there's a private ecosystem that emerges around it. And you know, one of the answers as to why this might be, and specific for a DPG relative to just another digital transformation solution, is this idea of generativity. This was in a paper put out, I believe, last year. Generativity is the system's capacity to produce unanticipated change through unfiltered contributions from broad and varied audiences. There's also this social element around it. You know, I really liked Jen's opening theoretical missive about how it's these kind of fluid social relationships, the ecosystem around things that end up really generating value, and it's very hard to measure, but it's very powerful. DPG specifically, so this generativity point gets to the idea of, you know, DPGs are distributed and they're recursive. So it enables a lot of people to participate, and then it's recursive, right? You can continue to iterate and build off it. So that might be one of the reasons why we see this value. Social value, the other dimension, you know, obviously a lot of these solutions are trying to enhance inclusion, bring more people in. Social service delivery, they provide a lot of value there. COVID-19 was a huge catalyst in every single one of the countries we looked at, where quickly they tried to either ramp up implementation or use the systems they had to deliver social assistance and social payments. So the flexibility that the systems afforded enabled them to be able to pivot and, you know, deliver social assistance at a time when countries were in lockdown. And then this idea of how these tools can strengthen the social contract. In Kyrgyzstan, where this Tunduk platform has been rolling out, they have taken all the paper-based government certificates and made them digital, gotten rid of all the opportunities for rent-seeking that existed in the system when you wanted to obtain a driver's license or a birth certificate, any of these other documents. And what it's done is it has compelled citizens to now, whenever they are dealing with the government or there is some process they have to go through, they demand it to be more efficient. They demand it to be digitized. It's a common refrain to hear people say, well, is there a Tunduk for this? Why isn't this on Tunduk? So it kind of strengthens the contract between the citizens and the state. There's an expectation that the state should deliver better because these systems are in place. Governance value, so how they can enhance state capacity, how they can encourage transparency. I think there's something about the fact that, I mean, so transparency both in the ability of the developers and the users of the systems in the public agencies, obviously they're able to see the source code. There's transparency there. They're able to act with it. But it also compels greater probity in the agencies because everything is transparent. State capacity is really about, a DPG compels you to build more in-house technical capacity instead of depending on external vendors. So that has knock-on effects. You're then building more capacity for other uses within the government. Big one was then political value, this dimension. So technological self-determination, you might call it. This is the ability to be able to make these feature changes, to steer the technological direction of your state on your own. Again, avoiding vendor lock-in is not just an economic proposition. There's a strong political dimension there. The Philippines, public servants and elected officials in the Philippines have borne very high political costs because of vendor lock-in, because they have these locked-in systems that don't advance what they say they're going to advance. So perceptions of government performance have really suffered because of being locked in. And then a huge thing, so data sovereignty or tech sovereignty, especially in this geopolitical moment, strong digital sovereignty is a paramount concern for governments. And I'll talk a little bit about how this showed up in the research, but countries are very wary of being caught between the US and China right now, and for a lot of reasons want to have sovereignty over their data and over their technological systems. It's a huge domestic political selling point in a lot of places also. So some of the lessons that came out of this that I'll point out. So the most cited value for the policymakers we interviewed was by far sovereignty and ownership. So it wasn't so much like the economic proposition of a DPG. It wasn't about the economic value. It was about the political and the governance value that sovereignty affords. And there was one DPG project leader said to me, like, sovereignty is the thing that they're paying for. That's what they really see the value in. The other thing is that politics always rule, so the political motivations were the strongest, and the political value that countries saw were the strongest. Again, the two strongest motivations were sovereignty and anti-corruption. Anti-corruption was more just why they needed to perform digital transformation, because there was a political imperative to do so, but it was really sovereignty. The thing that's interesting about digital public goods is they enable what Pablo Chavez, is a tech policy commentator, calls hybrid sovereignty. So sovereignty does not mean isolation. It does not mean self-sufficiency. In this context, it is both ownership paired with partnerships to acquire and obtain technology. And DPGs are very well suited for carrying out hybrid sovereignty. There are a lot of beneficial regional and international collaborations that enable countries to adopt these solutions and use these tools. Also, DPGs are not a panacea for vendor lock-in. So the story in the Philippines with the adoption of their digital ID system is that even though the platform itself was open and free and they weren't locked in, they had to rely on a systems integrator that was kind of new and underperformed, and they became locked into that. So in order to realize the value of a DPG and the promise of it, it requires in-house technical capacity. And there's a chicken and the egg kind of problem there, like how do you build it? Again, the private sector is critical, so building private sector ecosystems around these tools enables a great source of value. And the last thing I'll say is that there were different institutional and delivery models for each of these digital public goods. Luca made this point about PIX having the institution attached to it yesterday and the importance of that. The Philippines presented this interesting contrast where you had this venture-backed startup that is doing the same thing that PIX would be doing in a central bank institution, but through a small startup. So there are different models of delivery that can work for this. And perfect. That's my time. These are the future directions we might take this in. So more data. We need to quantify this better. This was, you know, a starting point. And doing this in more countries would be valuable too, because we only did 3, and obviously there's a lot of contextual diversity that comes in. So, thank you.